Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The wind in Enugu carried a kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, it was haunting. It whispered through the eaves of the house at number 12. Okpra Crescent, like it knew secrets it wasn't allowed to say out loud. That was where Eleanor first arrived, trailing behind her husband Chuka, carrying a medium-sized black box, her wedding band, and silence thick enough to be sliced with a razor blade. It had rained heavily the day before, and the earth still smelled of dampness and forgotten things. As she entered the family compound, Eleanor noticed the sharp contrast between her own stillness and the loud, cluttered chaos that buzzed around the household. Her new mother-in-law, Mama Chuka, stood in the doorway with a wrapper tied high above her stomach and a face that had forgotten how to smile without suspicion. "So you are the one," she said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Eleanor only nodded, already sensing the invisible test beginning. No welcome. No words of affirmation. Just a statement loaded with warning. The house itself was built like many of the old colonial remnants in that part of Enugu. Strong, wide, slightly cracked in places, but clinging to its structure with the desperation of something too proud to admit it was aging. The walls were thick, and the halls long enough to carry every whispered word from one end to another. That evening, after the bags were unpacked and the lights dimmed for PHCN's predictable power cut, Eleanor lay on a narrow mattress with a mosquito net tucked in like a funeral sheet, listening to the sound of a family that didn't know how to make room. Eleanor had never been the type to spill her story into the laps of strangers, not even the man she married. What Chuka knew of her background was enough to raise interest, but not enough to spark inquiry. She'd told him her parents were dead, true. She said she didn't have siblings, also true. But the part where she omitted her father's name, his legacy, and the fortune that now sat idle under her legal control in a dormant account in Lagos, that was the part she chose to keep under lock and key. Chuka didn't ask many questions, which suited her just fine. His interest in her had been casual at first, flaring to a determined flame once he realized how calm she was, how neatly she fit into his plans. "You are not like these modern girls," he had said once with pride. "You don't make noise." Eleanor had smiled, not because she agreed, but because the alternative was to explain the kind of silence she carried, the one that had grown inside her since she buried her father and walked away from the empire he left her. In the weeks that followed her arrival, Eleanor became a background note in the family's melody. She cleaned without complaint, cooked when asked, and kept her head down even when it meant being overlooked at family gatherings or ignored when guests came. Mama Chuka often tested her with subtle jabs. "You don't know how to grind pepper by hand? Nawao, girls of nowadays only know how to paint face." Eleanor would only smile faintly and say, "I will learn." And she did, slowly, quietly, like a student preparing for an exam no one knew she was taking. The first crack in her new life appeared when she offered to pay for a generator after 3 nights of blackout and sweat-soaked sleep. It was a casual suggestion, not meant to be provocative, but Mama Chuka's reaction was immediate and sharp. "Are you the head of this house? Are you the one earning money now?" she snapped. Eleanor had expected resistance, but not venom. Chuka, who was seated beside her, didn't say a word. He only picked his teeth slowly, as if trying to find a piece of meat he never ate. From that day, the air grew thicker around her. Every move she made was now watched through a lens of suspicion. Even simple things, sweeping too early, opening the fridge without permission, buying her own brand of soap, were interpreted as acts of rebellion. Eleanor adjusted. She made her world smaller. Woke earlier, spoke less, disappeared into the routine of domesticity like salt in soup. But every night, when the house quieted and Mama Chuka had retired to her room to listen to her evening gospel program, Eleanor sat behind the house under the pawpaw tree, clutching a leather-bound diary that contained more numbers than words, account balances, lawyer contacts, foreign addresses, silent proof of a life that could shake this household to its roots if ever revealed. She never wrote in it. She didn't need to. Her mind was sharp, her memory sharper. The diary was only a reminder. She was not what they thought she was. Time passed, and Enugu's dry season began to crawl in with dust and brittle leaves. The compound lost its color, the flowers dried up, and tempers flared easier with every new heat wave. Eleanor's skin grew 2 shades darker under the relentless sun, her hands rougher from constant washing, but her eyes, those almond-shaped eyes, remained unyielding. Her neighbors rarely saw her outside the compound. When they did, they described her as the quiet one, or the girl who never talks. One woman from the next compound once approached her at the communal borehole. "You day okay?" she asked cautiously, glancing around as if afraid to be seen speaking to her. Eleanor only nodded, lifting her yellow gallon. She had long learned that pity was a slippery thing. It could come today like help and leave tomorrow like mockery. Inwardly, she had begun counting the days. Not because she was desperate to leave, but because she had sensed the tide shifting. Chuka had grown colder, distracted. Sometimes he came home smelling like hotel air freshener. Other times, he ignored her entirely. Eleanor had never questioned him. Her silence was not permission, it was strategy. Let him walk. Let them all walk. She had long decided that when the time came, her exit would be the kind they would never forget. Not with noise, but with absence so loud it would echo. The morning began like many others, unremarkable, but heavy with unspoken weight. The aroma of burning firewood drifted into the small kitchen as Eleanor stirred a pot of watery oji, the kind Mama Chuka insisted on drinking every morning with a scowl on her face, claiming it keeps the bones from rusting. The rhythm of her hands had become muscle memory, but her mind was far away, drifting through her thoughts like an unmoored canoe in a foggy river. There was a tension creeping into her bones now, the kind that doesn't come from work, but from waiting for something to shift, to break, or to finally reveal itself. The household had grown noisier in small, strange ways. Mama Chuka had become more direct with her criticisms, not bothering to hide them behind polite phrases anymore. "You can't even iron wrapper without leaving lines like road demarcation," she had scoffed one morning. Eleanor didn't argue. She simply refolded the wrapper, placed it over the ironing board, and did it again, as if she had no other choice in the world but to prove herself to someone who had already made up her mind. Chuka, on the other hand, had turned into a ghost with skin. He came and went without rhythm. His presence in the house felt more like a passing shadow than a husband. At first, Eleanor tried to hold on to his attention with the little things, making his favorite jollof rice, pressing his shirts to crisp perfection, leaving him notes in his wardrobe pockets. But nothing stuck. He read the notes, folded them neatly, and placed them in the bin. No reaction, no confrontation, just slow erasure. The part that bit the hardest wasn't the insults or the indifference. It was the quiet disconnection, like a bridge slowly collapsing under the weight of silence. Eleanor had always known the rules of being an outsider. Don't speak unless spoken to, smile without reason, endure without protest. But this was a new game. Mama Chuka began setting invisible traps, small provocations designed to test her reactions. One day, she instructed Eleanor to scrub the compound with soap and a broom, an unnecessary chore considering the cement floor. But Eleanor did it anyway, moving from corner to corner, sweating under the unforgiving sun as Mama Chuka sipped zobo in the shade. When she was done, her fingers were wrinkled and raw. Later that evening, she overheard her mother-in-law telling a neighbor, "She's quiet, yes, but quiet people have devil in them too." The comment didn't sting as much as it should have. It was almost expected now. Eleanor had reached a point where words became dust on her skin, easy to brush off. Yet in the depths of her, something else was forming. A pressure. A swelling. It wasn't rage, no, Eleanor wasn't the type to shout or break plates. It was something older, wiser, an awareness that all storms begin quietly, building layer by layer until the sky splits open. Each day now felt like another drop in the basin, slowly filling. She no longer tried to gain approval. She moved through the house with a soft dignity that unnerved them more than rebellion ever could. She smiled when they wanted her to frown. She yielded when they expected resistance. And in doing so, she became unreadable. That scared them more than anything. That week, Eleanor began waking even earlier, sometimes as early as 3:45 a.m., stepping out into the cold morning air just to be alone before the day's expectations swallowed her whole. She would sit on the low cement stool by the mango tree and breathe, just breathe. The air was cleaner then, untouched by voices, scolding, or the metallic clang of pots. It was the only time she remembered who she was before the ring slid onto her finger, before the compound walls began to feel like a slow-motion prison. She found herself thinking about her father often during those hours, the way he would sit with her on the balcony of their Ikoyi home and speak in metaphors. "Life is like Accra," he once said. "If the oil is too hot, it burns outside but remains raw inside." He had taught her to observe before acting, to listen before speaking, to know her power before displaying it. And she had listened closely. She had chosen to live simply with Chuka because she wanted to escape the glare of wealth, the suffocation of boardrooms and men in suits who bowed only to bank balances. But now, surrounded by people who assumed simplicity was the same as helplessness, she began to reconsider the wisdom of hiding one's wings. That morning, as she watched the sky shift from dark indigo to powdery blue, a calm determination began to form. Not revenge, not even escape, just return. Return to herself, to her mind, to her name. The thought wasn't heavy. It was as soft as fog, but it lingered long after the sun rose. Later that week, a small incident served as a turning point. Not loud, not dramatic, just another brick in the wall of Eleanor's quiet decision. Mama Chuka had sent her to the main road in the scorching afternoon sun to buy a specific brand of crayfish, insisting no one else could get it right. Eleanor walked the 15-minute journey without complaint, her slippers slicing through the dust like dull machetes. At the market, the seller, a stout, gap-toothed woman with a voice like gravel, recognized her immediately. "You know Bicinello, daughter?" the woman asked, squinting. "That big man from Lagos that die like film trick?" Eleanor froze for a second, her hand mid-reach for a sachet of seasoning. "I don't know who you're talking about," she said, quickly paying for the items and walking away. But inside, her stomach turned. The past had a way of following you like your shadow under harsh light. It stretched, distorted, but always kept pace. Back home, Mama Chuka was waiting with folded arms. "You're slow like snail," she snapped. "If you were in my time, you for Don Mary and return by now." Eleanor handed over the crayfish without a word and walked to her room, not in defeat, but with the steady grace of someone who had reached a finish line others didn't know existed. That night, as Chuka lay snoring beside her, reeking of alcohol and perfume that didn't belong to her, Eleanor sat up and looked at him for a long time. Not with sadness, not with longing, but with clarity. The basin was nearly full now. One more drop, and the river would flood. The sun had barely climbed over the low roofs of the neighborhood when the first wave of tension broke inside the house like the tide snapping against a shoreline. Eleanor had finished sweeping the corridor outside her room when she heard Chuka's voice, low, tight, and unusually deliberate, speaking on the phone. She paused beside the wooden column that led into the main parlor, not to eavesdrop, but because the way he whispered her name caught her attention. "She doesn't ask questions, that's the good part," he said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for him to walk into the kitchen, then continue. "Yes, she's still there. No walla from her end. She just stay." That sentence settled on Eleanor's skin like a cold hand. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, as if she were a piece of luggage, a background fixture, a compliant ghost. She returned to her room and sat still on the bed for a long time. The stillness inside her chest was beginning to feel familiar. It wasn't sadness that had been buried weeks ago. It was a silent recalibration, a rearranging of expectations. She was no longer waiting for affection or redemption. What she was waiting for now, what she had been building toward quietly, was a decision, one that would be final. That afternoon, Chuka returned home with an empty expression and the smell of beer in his breath. He didn't greet her. He didn't even glance her way as he walked past her at the kitchen sink. And Eleanor didn't speak either. Sometimes the sharpest knives are the ones never drawn. By evening, the house felt like a hive of agitation. Mama Chuka, who had spent the earlier part of the day gossiping with neighbors about a divorce case down the road, returned with fresh contempt steaming from her forehead. Eleanor barely finished plating the rice before the familiar strike came. "I don't know what we did wrong to deserve a woman who behaves like she's doing us a favor," she began, slamming her spoon against the ceramic plate as she scooped rice into her bowl. "You don't even kneel to serve your husband his food. How were you raised?" Her voice was sharp and sour, like fermented augury. Eleanor kept her gaze low, her hands moving methodically as she placed the food in front of Chuka. "It's okay," she said softly. "No, it is not okay," the older woman barked, her voice echoing into the corridor. "You think marriage is play? You want to come here and do as you like." Chuka continued eating like nothing was happening, his eyes fixed on the television screen showing a muted football match. Eleanor's voice remained steady, even when her fingers began to tremble slightly. "I said I'm sorry," she whispered. But there was no apology in her tone, just controlled detachment. A dull rumble of thunder rolled in the distance, as if the sky itself had overheard the tension and decided to listen in. Later that night, Eleanor folded her wrapper neatly into a corner of her wooden wardrobe and sat down to write something in a slim notebook she hadn't touched in months. She didn't write names. She wrote movements. A plan. Quiet steps. Exit points. And under one small, tightly curled line, she scribbled 5 words. When they speak, I move. 2 days passed before the final blow came, the one that didn't sting but sealed everything in place like the last nail in a well-measured coffin. It happened over something small, as these things often do, barely enough to make headlines in a normal household, but enough to shatter whatever semblance of peace had been artificially maintained. Eleanor had mistakenly left a wet towel hanging over the wooden chair in the corridor, and Mama Chuka spotted it while on her way to her room. The shouting started like a match strike, sudden, sharp. "You want to spoil everything in this house," she screamed. "No respect. No manners. Ordinary house training. You don't have." The accusation rose quickly, spreading like dry season fire. Chuka walked out of the room, shirtless, holding his phone with earphones dangling from his neck, and looked at the scene as though he had stumbled into a quarrel at the market. "This is getting too much," he said. "This is not working." Eleanor stood silently, holding the edge of the corridor door, her face calm but pale. "Then say what you mean," she said, not in defiance, but with finality. Chuka rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at his mother as if for permission. "Maybe it's time you go back to wherever you came from." That was it. No ceremony, no tears. Just a string of words strung together by convenience and cowardice. Mama Chuka nodded triumphantly, as if she had won a long-drawn battle. "At least this one knows when to walk away," she muttered. Eleanor turned and walked into her room, not hurriedly, not with drama, but with the grace of someone removing herself from the table she was no longer invited to sit at. That night, as the moon slipped between clouds and Enugu held its breath in the damp quiet, Eleanor gathered the few things she considered hers. A red shawl her father gave her when she was 19. A pair of leather sandals she bought at Balagan Market before she left Lagos. Her notebook, and a small pouch of documents, old and fragile, but powerful in their quiet authority. She didn't pack heavily, there was no need. Her world wasn't in that house, nor had it ever been. Around 4 a.m., when the sky still wore its dark shawl and the streets were empty, she stepped out of the gate without a single backward glance. The silence in the compound was complete, broken only by the occasional crow of an eager rooster. She walked toward the main road, each step deliberate, her shoulders squared as though she were marching toward herself. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows behind her that looked like they belonged to another woman entirely. As she reached the junction where Kiki drivers would soon begin their early rounds, she took out her phone and made a single call. It was picked on the first ring. "Good morning, Ma," the voice said. "We're ready when you are." She gave the address, short and sharp. Then she waited. And in that waiting, she felt the weight she had carried for so long slowly begin to unfasten itself from her shoulders. Not all storms announce themselves with thunder. Some come with slippers on their feet and silence in their hearts, and by the time you realize they were ever there, the sky has already cleared. The car that arrived was unlike anything that had ever rolled into that part of Enugu. Its engine didn't roar, it hummed, smooth and unbothered, like something too refined for the dusty roads it temporarily graced. A black SUV with bulletproof windows and discreet tinted glass slid to a halt in front of the designated filling station, where Eleanor stood quietly, her small brown bag resting by her feet. The driver stepped out without urgency, dressed in a deep navy suit and sunglasses despite the hour. He didn't ask for her name, he didn't need to. He simply opened the back door, gave a short nod, and moved aside. Eleanor bent slightly, picked up her bag, and entered the car without looking back. As the door shut, a quiet wind rustled through the neem trees beside the road, carrying with it the final breath of the woman she had pretended to be. The driver didn't speak, and neither did she. They didn't need to. The silence inside the vehicle was not tense, it was sacred, the kind that forms when something important has ended and something more important is about to begin. The car merged back onto the road, cutting through the early morning emptiness of Enugu like a thought moving toward intention. She stared out the window, watching the buildings shrink and blend into the landscape. The city that had demanded so much from her gave no resistance to her departure. It didn't try to hold her back. It never had, perhaps because it had never truly known her. Eleanor didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't flinch. There was no triumph, no vengeance stirring in her chest. Just an unusual peace, a soft, sober awareness that some chapters end not with noise, but with a quiet closing of a door. The road to the airport was long, cutting through familiar streets that now felt like strangers. Eleanor watched them with the detachment of someone passing through a dream she had once lived in, but no longer claimed. Vendors were already setting up their stalls, the familiar clatter of crates and rustle of nylon bags mixing with the sound of early morning radio stations humming from portable speakers. The city was waking up, unaware that it was also forgetting someone. They drove past the tailoring shop where she once mended a torn blouse, the corner suya stand where Chuka had stood laughing with friends on a night he forgot to come home. They passed the pharmacy, where she had once bought paracetamol, with the last N500 in her pocket, after enduring 2 days of fever, without a word of concern from anyone in the house. These memories didn't hurt anymore. They weren't even bitter. They simply sat in her mind like dried leaves, once part of her, but no longer alive. The driver turned into a private access road that led to a restricted wing of the airport. There was no security drama, no questioning. The gates opened as if they had been waiting for her. Eleanor stepped out and was greeted by a woman in a tailored gray suit holding a digital tablet. "Welcome back, Ma," the woman said with a small bow. Eleanor nodded once, calm and still. It wasn't her first time walking across a tarmac, but it was her first time doing it without the need to shrink herself. Her steps were quiet, but assured. She wasn't running away from anything. She was returning to everything she left behind. By the time she boarded the jet and took her seat near the window, the first golden thread of morning had stretched across the clouds, casting a faint warmth on her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, not to calm herself, but to remember who she had always been. The quiet hum of the engine vibrated through her spine like a soft chant, whispering welcome into the marrow of her bones. She wasn't going back to Lagos as a guest or a visitor or a widow's daughter. She was going back as Eleanor Chinelo Okeke, heiress of the Okeke estate, sole custodian of a legacy that had once made the front pages of every financial paper in the country. For years, she had buried that part of herself, folding it away like old documents, kept but never displayed. Her father's death had come too fast, the legal battles too bitter, and her spirit too disillusioned by the vultures that circled before the funeral dust had even settled. She had fled not because she couldn't fight, but because she didn't want to. She had wanted love instead, a quiet life, an ordinary home where her name meant nothing and her worth was measured in kindness, not capital. But fate, as always, had other plans. And now, she was no longer fleeing. She was reclaiming. Not just wealth, but peace. Not just power, but presence. She opened her eyes and looked out at the sky, calm and endless. There was no trace of the small bungalow in Enugu, no echo of the cold nights, no scent of bitter pepper soup. Just the wind. And her name, spoken only in her mind, but louder now than ever before. Touchdown in Lagos was seamless. A convoy of 2 dark sedans waited quietly on the tarmac as the plane taxied to a halt. No questions were asked. No photos were taken. This wasn't the celebrity spectacle the tabloids would have craved. It was quieter, older money. The kind that didn't need to announce its return. Eleanor stepped onto the runway with the quiet elegance of someone used to disappearing and reappearing as she pleased. Her assistant, a young man named Os, sharp-eyed and observant, met her with a warm smile and a detailed itinerary. "The legal team will meet us at the residence by 11, he said, walking beside her. "Everything is in place." She nodded, adjusting her sunglasses. The gates of the city opened for her like a home returning its long-lost daughter. She was driven to her family estate in Ikoyi, the sprawling mansion covered in ivy and stories, both whispered and written. As she entered the compound, even the birds seemed to pause their song. The staff lined up like a memory brought to life. Some of them she remembered. Some were new. All bowed. She walked past them, her footsteps landing soft on the stone path, and reached the front door. A gold-plated plaque still bore her father's name, worn slightly at the edges. She touched it briefly, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood polish and time. Her father's study remained untouched. The armchair was still draped with the Ankara shawl he used every Harmattan. She stood there in silence, not to mourn, but to honor. The woman who once bent under the weight of someone else's household had returned to her own, not louder, not prouder, but completely, unmistakably whole. The days that followed Eleanor's return to Lagos moved like silk drawn through slow fingers, elegant, controlled, and purposeful. She did not arrive with announcements. There were no interviews, no press conferences, no sudden headlines declaring her return to the city's elite. Yet the people who needed to know knew. The whispers started in elevators and conference lounges, among men in imported suits who once laughed at the news that Robert Okeke's only daughter had disappeared after his burial. She vanished like money in bad investment, one had said years ago. But now, those same men found themselves refreshing old numbers, reaching out through former aides, hoping to get 5 minutes on her calendar. Eleanor did not grant those meetings. She chose silence over spectacle. Her re-emergence was not to settle scores but to realign the table, to reoccupy a chair that had been left vacant only because she allowed it to be. Each morning, she rose before the staff, her steps soft along the marbled floors of the Ikoyi mansion that still bore her childhood fingerprints in forgotten corners. The housekeeper, Madame Aduak, was the only person Eleanor allowed to speak freely in her presence. The older woman had worked under her father for nearly 2 decades and looked at Eleanor now not with awe, but with quiet approval. "Your father would have smiled today," she said one morning while preparing bitter leaf soup. "You're not like him, but you carry his steadiness." Eleanor didn't respond with words. She only nodded, gently brushing her fingers across the rim of the glass bowl beside her, watching as the steam from the soup rose and disappeared, just like her grief once did. Inside the boardrooms of Okeke Holdings, however, Eleanor's silence did not mean passivity. Her return sparked a ripple that soon turned tidal. The interim board that had been running the conglomerate since her father's passing had grown too comfortable. Some of them had assumed the will was more ceremonial than legal. Others believed the heiress, having rejected the wealth for years, would have no appetite for power now. But they were wrong, and they found that out the moment Eleanor entered the first shareholder meeting in a gray suit and sea-glass scarf, her steps unhurried but final. She listened more than she spoke. Her voice, when it came, did not rise. It held the same strength as a river's undercurrent, quiet but unstoppable. The chairman, a man named Chief Adeniran, tried to mask his surprise when she calmly challenged one of his quarterly projections. "That contract in Rivers State," she said, flipping through a thin document, "was revalued 6 months ago. You submitted the old figures. It's $28 million short." He faltered. She didn't. She moved from one section of the report to the next like someone reading a book she had already memorized. By the time the meeting ended, the room had changed temperature. Everyone present understood she had not come back to collect her inheritance. She had come to lead. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Lagos skyline and the city's noise returned to its usual volume, Eleanor stood on the balcony of her father's study, looking out at the orange-stained sky. Her assistant, Os, stepped forward with an envelope. "They've confirmed the press found out," he said carefully. 3 outlets have requested interviews. Channels, Arise, and 1 foreign. Eleanor turned her face slightly, her expression unreadable. "No press," she said. "Not yet. Not now." The story would spread anyway, but it would spread without her help. Let them guess. Let them wonder. It was exactly 9 days after her return that Chuka called. The number appeared on her phone screen just before midnight, a time when most people's pride slept. She didn't answer. The first message arrived 2 minutes later. Then another. And another. At first, they were cautious, groping for civility. "Just checking in, hope you're alright, saw the news." Then came the apologies, poured like palm wine, sweet but intoxicating. "I didn't mean for things to end that way. You deserve better. Maybe we rushed too many things." Eleanor read each one without blinking, her face as composed as a still lake. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel flattered. If anything, the messages felt like whispers through a closed window, barely audible, no longer relevant. On the 11th day, a brown envelope arrived at the mansion, hand-delivered. Inside it was a letter, handwritten in Chuka's careful scrawl. It didn't beg. It didn't blame. It simply recounted their first meeting in Ibadan, a memory he thought would melt something. He ended the letter with a single question. "Can we talk?" Eleanor folded the letter once, then again, and placed it inside her bottom drawer without reply. Some doors, when shut, echo if opened again. She wasn't interested in hearing echoes. Not now. That evening, she stood by the old family piano, her fingers gently pressing random keys. She wasn't playing music. She was reminding herself what it meant to create without obligation. She thought of the girl she had been in Enugu, tamed, tested, dismissed. And then she thought of the woman who stood here now, shaping silence into strategy. It was not power she was after. It was sovereignty. Meanwhile, far away in Enugu, the house that once held her felt different. Mama Chuka moved through the rooms with a restlessness she couldn't explain, her footsteps growing heavier each day. The neighbors were talking. They always talked, but this time, it was about Eleanor. Whispers found their way into markets, churches, even hair salons. "You know that quiet girl Chuka married?" someone would begin. "She's not just somebody, she's the only daughter of that big man from Lagos, Okeke Holdings." At first, Mama Chuka laughed it off. Then she went online and found the headlines herself. The pictures were unmistakable. There was Eleanor, seated beside a foreign ambassador, her name printed in bold on company documents, her return described as a calculated and graceful reclaiming of influence. The laughter drained from Mama Chuka's mouth like oil from overfried akra. Chuka, for his part, walked through the house like a man nursing an invisible wound. He no longer brought friends home. He no longer commented on food. He often stared into space, holding his phone as if it still contained something it had lost. One day, a young relative asked about Eleanor. Chuka's reply was short. "She's doing well." But even that simple truth hung in the air like a reprimand. They had sent her away thinking she was baggage. They never imagined she was treasure wrapped in stillness. Back in Lagos, Eleanor sat in her father's leather chair, flipping through documents with the same ease she once used to fold wrappers. She wasn't just rebuilding a legacy. She was proving, to herself, not to them, that no one's voice had the right to redefine her name again. There was something about the way the world moved now that made everything feel slightly rearranged. Eleanor noticed it not in grand gestures, but in the tiniest details, how people paused longer before they spoke to her, how their greetings carried caution wrapped in admiration, how doors that once needed knocking now opened before her fingers could reach the handle. The weight of being seen again, after choosing invisibility, was not something she wore lightly. It came with an awareness she hadn't felt in years, a quiet understanding that presence was not just about being somewhere, but about being undeniable once you arrived. Her days had settled into a deliberate rhythm, full but not frantic. Mornings were for estate reviews and legal consultations. Afternoons were for architectural meetings regarding her father's abandoned development sites, some of which she decided to revive not for profit, but because he would have wanted them completed. Evenings belonged to herself. No one was allowed to interrupt those hours, not even Os. She would sit in the garden, surrounded by plants her mother once nurtured, her fingers stroking the curved edges of newspaper clippings people had sent her anonymously. Headlines from across the country, some praising her quiet return, others spinning stories out of speculation. She never replied to the calls, never accepted the invitations to speak publicly. Not because she was afraid, but because she was finally content with letting her work speak louder than her words. She had spoken enough through endurance. Now her silence said all that needed to be said. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It came not from Chuka, but from someone Eleanor had never met, a young woman named Adago, who introduced herself as Chuka's niece. The handwriting was neat, almost studied, and the words it carried were a gentle mix of apology and curiosity. She wrote that things in Enugu were no longer the same, that the house felt like a place where a lesson had passed through and left its echo behind. She said Chuka barely spoke to anyone anymore, that he spent long nights on the porch staring at nothing, and that Mama Chuka no longer ruled the compound with the same thunderous grip. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it beside her window. She did not reply, not out of resentment, but because there was nothing left to add. The story had already told itself. People often asked if she missed that life, if she missed the man she had once married. She never answered. Because what could she say? That love, when given to the wrong heart, turns into duty? That silence can either be strength or slow suffocation, depending on who hands it to you. She knew now that some returns weren't meant to happen, and some doors, even when left ajar, must remain unopened. That evening, she walked barefoot into the hallway where her father's portrait still hung, stately and quiet, just like the man she remembered. She looked at it for a while, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, not with her lips, but with something deeper. A kind of peace you can only carry after losing and choosing yourself all over again. She had learned that dignity is not always about walking out with your head held high. Sometimes it's about standing so still that people are forced to notice the depth of what they tried to overlook. Her reappearance had not been a performance, and it would never become one. She didn't want to become a symbol or a cautionary tale or even an icon. All she wanted was the right to define herself on her own terms. And now she had that. The estate grew quieter with each passing week, not in neglect, but in fullness. Projects moved forward. The trust fund left for her by her father was being expanded to support private educational institutions in remote towns. Again, not for praise, but because it aligned with something inside her. Her face remained absent from public billboards. She declined award ceremonies. When a well-known women's group sent her a glowing nomination letter, she thanked them and returned it politely with a handwritten note. Some stories do not need stages. Mine prefers stillness. And that was the truth. The version of herself that once sought affection by being agreeable no longer existed. In her place stood a woman whose boundaries were firm, whose eyes no longer searched rooms for approval, and whose silence was no longer mistaken for confusion. The people who had failed her were not her enemies. They were her mirrors, showing her how much of herself she had once placed into the wrong hands. She didn't hate them, but she would never return to them. Some lessons, once learned, leave no room for rehearsal. There was a knock at the main gate one humid Saturday afternoon. Os answered it and returned a moment later with a puzzled look on his face. "Ma, there's a woman outside," he said slowly. "She says she came from Enugu. She gave her name, Agatha." Eleanor paused. The name hung in the air like the last drop of rain before a storm. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask him to send the woman away. But she didn't rush to receive her either. Instead, she stepped into her sitting room, took a glass of water, and sat quietly for several minutes. When she finally stood and walked out to the gate, she found the woman standing just beyond the threshold, older, smaller than she remembered, her once fiery eyes dulled by something softer. There were no greetings, no long-winded explanations. Agatha simply said, "I came to say sorry." And Eleanor, standing there in linen trousers and soft slippers, looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Nothing more. No hug. No anger. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two women who finally saw each other clearly. As Agatha turned and walked away, Eleanor remained at the gate, staring at the path where the woman disappeared. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She only felt finished, with that chapter, with that wound, with that silence. When she turned and walked back inside, she closed the gate gently behind her. And with that single simple motion, the story ended, not with a crash or a roar, but with the softest kind of closure. The kind that doesn't echo but settles. The kind that feels like home. In this life, never let anyone reduce your worth simply because you choose to be calm, respectful, or silent. There is a difference between being quiet and being weak. Know who you are, even if others don't see it yet. You don't have to explain your value to those committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes, your peace is louder than any defense. When it's time, rise, not with noise but with purpose. May you never find yourself in a place that does not recognize your light. May your silence never be mistaken for weakness, and may your strength speak even when your lips don't. May you be surrounded by people who honor you, not only when you rise, but when you kneel in humility. May your destiny never be delayed by the ignorance of those who cannot see your value. When the time comes for your breakthrough, may it be silent, undeniable, and perfect. And may you walk boldly into your purpose, without shame, without apology, and without looking back. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.